Hey, welcome back to our study of James chapter 1. We're going to finish up our section verses 1 through 12 today. Start with verse 13 next week. It's a little windy today. I'm outside, so if you see the camera shake a little bit, I just wanted to be outside. Really enjoying this time of the year when it kind of starts to slack off on some of the heat. Well, again, James chapter 1. Last week we made a couple of points from James chapter 1, and first of all, first point was a faith that works has plenty of room for life not working. And then secondly, faith in a relationship with God does not protect us necessarily from adversity, right? Okay, well, we're going to pick up with another takeaway today, and that is that faith must be tested in order for it to be strengthened. And this is the theme of verses 2 through 4. Where he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Well, that's a tall order, isn't it? James says, consider it all a pure joy when you encounter trials. And I'm like, what? What are you saying, James? Really? You can't be serious. But I think it's important for us to understand what he's saying here. That word consider is taken from the world of finance. And basically, essentially what it means is to count it in a certain way or to evaluate it in a certain way, to count the value of something. So this should just kind of chill us out, if you will, when it comes to this particular passage and understanding it. Because maybe we're thinking, hey, I'm not feeling the emotional aspect of joy when I'm going through a trial. So I think I would say here is, listen, don't put so much pressure on yourself. I think you need to understand what he's saying. He's not saying that at all. He's saying consider it, count it in a particular way, count the value of it. So essentially what James is doing is he's calling us to a particular mindset when we're going through a difficult time and trials. We should count it in a certain way. Because again, he's saying, because we know that the testing of our faith produces perseverance, and perseverance has to complete its work, so we are not lacking in anything. So here's the deal on this passage. James assumes that you and I value maturity and completeness. Nobody uses these words more than James himself. These are words of high value to him, as he is filled with the Holy Spirit in writing to these particular Christians. They come up time and again in the book of James. So James, again, he's assuming something, though. He's assuming that we value maturity and completeness. So here's the deal. The degree to which Gary Ray considers it joy, when I'm going through facing a trial or a difficult time, is directly related to the degree to which I value maturity and completeness as a Christian. So you understand what I'm saying here, right? James is saying that going through a trial puts us in a position to mature. Well, of course, that's great news as long as I value maturity and completeness as a Christian, right? But I have news for everybody. There's not always times when I'm facing a trial or a difficulty in my life where I kind of look at it that way. Sometimes the reality of it is that God is more interested in my maturity and completeness than I am when I'm going through a difficult time. But I think it's important for us to understand what he's not saying. He's not saying that you need to have some, count it all joy in some kind of psychotic, dysfunctional, sort of way that you're like a masochist and, just loves to endure, difficult things. Again, he's not saying that. He is saying that you ought to be able to see it in a certain way and from a certain perspective and understand that God works in every trial to bring about our maturity. By the way, James spends no time at all, zero time, on the source of that particular trial. What's more important for James is for us to realize that God is at work in the midst of trials that we're going through, whatever they are in your life and wherever they come from. Trials so oftentimes get the best of Gary Ray, but things do work out ultimately for the glory of God. So it's interesting reading this research project from the University of California, Berkeley, and they were studying amoebas and the life cycle of amoebas, if you will. So they were trying to find out something from the smallest organisms in life on the whole planet. And one of their experience was to inject amoebas into this absolutely perfect environment, absolutely stress-free, the perfect moisture, just the perfect food. Everything was just absolutely perfect. The perfect moisture. These amoebas had it all. The ideal food supplies, everything. And they got to live in a world that you and I kind of dream of living in, one that we kind of fantasize about, right? Where everything that's causing them heartache and stress and anxiety or whatever, all that stuff is taken out of the way. So it's this perfect world for amoebas to live in. And would you believe this, that every single one of those amoebas died, amazingly? Well, what if there's something about the development and life of all living things that requires challenges and resistance? What if the reality of things that we fantasize about, of us consuming and having things our way and having things perfect and not having any trials or difficulties, what if there's something about that really only ends up leading to deterioration? And that means this is just really curious to me. David Brooks wrote this article in the New York Times back in 2014, and it's completely from a secular perspective, but I want to read some portions of it to you because it's really interesting. He says, "We live in a culture that's awash in talk about happiness. In one 3-month period last year, more than 1,000 books were released on Amazon on that particular subject. But notice this phenomenon: when people remember the past, they don't talk about happiness. It's often the ordeals that seem most significant. People shoot for happiness, but feel formed through suffering." Interesting. I'll read on down further. He says, "The right response to this sort of pain is not pleasure, it's holiness. I don't mean it in a purely religious sense. It means seeing life as a moral drama, placing the hard experiences in a moral context, and trying to redeem something bad by turning it into something sacred. Recovering from suffering," he writes, "is not like recovering from a disease. Many people don't come out of it healed. They come out of it different." Very interesting. And that's come from a secular perspective. What's interesting is that the word testing that James uses in verse 3 and in verse 12 is the word that a potter would use when they're putting a vessel into a fire, and the goal is for it not to crack. The goal is for it really to come out strengthened. Again, if the vessel is put in the fire by the potter and it comes out without essentially without cracking, if it survives the fire, the potter would take a stamp and it would stamp on that vessel the word dokimos. A potter's intention is not to destroy the vessel, but to strengthen the vessel by putting it in the fire. Fire is not an option. Fire is a necessity to strengthen the vessel. And that's the word that James uses in this particular chapter. Same thing can be said of precious metals, of gold and platinum, for example. It's more valuable after it's gone through the fire and after it's been melted down from its raw form. And this is also true of our faith as well. It's going to have to go through some meltdowns, if you will. But it does involve our cooperation at some level, which leads me to another takeaway from this particular passage, isn't that a faith that works asks God for wisdom and not just why. And this is the theme of verses 5 through 8. Let's read that. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that's driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded man, unstable in all of his ways. So here's the deal. When we're going through trials and adversity in our lives, it often redirects our vision towards heaven. Our attention, goes heavenward. But here's what James is saying. When you're going through a difficult circumstance like this or a trial in your life, ask God for wisdom. Notice he says absolutely nothing about why, about asking why. Because most people will typically ask when they're going through a difficult circumstance, why? God doesn't ever promise that he will explain himself when we're going through adversity or trials in our life. He never promises that. You can ask him why, but he doesn't provide an explanation. What he does promise is that he'll give you wisdom in the midst of the trial, in the midst of adversity that you're going through. James says God's going to give it to you and give it to you generously to all of those who ask for it. But don't be double-minded in asking about it. God wants to give it to you. I kind of think sometimes that if we get to heaven, God's going to open up this whole treasure trove and say, this was here for you. You just needed to ask for it. Well, he's saying here, when you're going through this, ask for wisdom. Don't ask when you're going through a trial and prayer, I'm going to ask, but, he's probably not going to give it to me. No, he says ask in confidence and ask in faith, because God does want to give it to you. Push beyond asking why. We talked about that last week. And ask God for wisdom in how to respond to a particular trial, because the trial is not going to go away. There comes a time when we have to just kind of move beyond the asking of why and ask what's God's purpose in that and how we are going to respond to it. Speaking of wisdom in the midst of a trial, James moves into another area of trials and dealing with, and that's regarding money and material things, which moves us to another point, and that is a faith that works keeps the material world in perspective. And so we're going to see that in verses 9 through 11. So let's go ahead and pick up in our reading there. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls, and the beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. It was really easy in this particular culture to be deceived by money and by riches and material possessions. Back then, people in humble circumstances were often led to think that God isn't on their side because of their circumstance, that God isn't at work in their lives. Many people in that culture, on the other hand, thought if a person was rich, that, God was working in their lives and present in their lives. And you would think in that culture, if you were poor, that God had distanced himself from you, and there must be something that you've done to deserve this, or perhaps there was something that your parents had done that brought you to that particular circumstance. And so again, on the flip side, if you were wealthy, people thought, well, God's approved of you. Well, James takes this concept that people had in that culture and turns it on its head, turns it upside down with wisdom from heaven. He puts it this way: for those of you in humble circumstances that are poor, you have not been left by God. If you're going through a trial, you have not been, or adversity, you've not been left by God. If anything, God's at work with you and in you in the midst of your challenges. Rather than being in a low position, you're in a high position. God has his eyes on you and he's doing something with you. And, I'm sure a lot of the people during that time frame would say, please, I don't want so much divine attention, in my direction. But James is saying this is not a sign that God has left you at all. You're in a high position. God's at work in your life and he sees you. And then he says something to the wealthy that are scattered. The rich should take pride in their humiliation because they'll pass away like a wildflower. I believe he's really kind of talking to two different sets or two different classes or different groups of people here in James chapter 1 that are scattered. Some who used to be wealthy and now in the dispersion, the persecution, they're no longer wealthy. They've lost their businesses, they've lost their resources, they've left Jerusalem, and they've been forced to start over. But I think he's also talking to another particular group of people who have yet to lose what they have, but they will lose it eventually. Like somebody once said 20 years ago, they said, we had Steve Jobs and Bob Hope and Johnny Cash, and now we have no jobs and no cash and no hope. Well, things can change on us. As difficult as a season as that may be, James says, when that happens, as odd as it may sound, take pride in that moment, since honestly, it's going to pass away like a wildflower anyway. In other words, and I want you to listen to me very closely when I say this, when you lose something that you've had that's of material worth or value, that's actually an opportunity to be reminded of what really matters in this life and what doesn't, of what's really valuable and what's not. Some of you listening, you've lost something of value. I know that I have. And we have a tendency sometimes to be deceived by material possessions and resources. And to the poor, James is saying, don't think that when you find yourself in this circumstance that God has left you. If anything, God is with you and he's working to mature you and to bring you to completeness. And to those who do have something, he says, and you're going through a trial, particularly perhaps losing it, James is saying, I know it's humiliating. I know it's humiliating to lose your job, to lose your car, to lose your 401k, to downsize, to lose your retirement fund, but allow God to work through that particular circumstance. See it as an opportunity to see what's really important. Because sometimes it takes losing what you cannot keep to help you learn to rejoice in what you cannot lose. I'll say that again. Sometimes it takes losing what you cannot keep anyway to help you learn to rejoice in what you cannot lose. Well, that's a feature of a faith that works in the real world. Speaking of that, here's our final wrap-up point. A faith that works keeps eternity in view. Verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. Confidence in the next world, in what's ahead in the next world, can enable you to have joy in this world, even when you're going through very difficult circumstances in your life. Paul puts it this way in Romans chapter 8, verse 18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So just stop right there. There are some of you listening to this who are suffering in very profound ways. Losing loved ones, the others who are sick in this world of COVID that we're living in. There's been so many people who've suffered losses and are going through very difficult circumstances. And he's saying, as hard as this may be, to look at it through the eye of faith and see it in a way that to understand that it's not worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed, and the glory that's going to be revealed in you. Paul said it another way in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." So what Paul's saying is, what is ahead is so great, it's so awesome, it's so fantastic, that whatever is so bad in this life will be considered as light and momentary. Jesus never promised us that it would be easy in this life, but he did promise that it would be worth it. So when I think of what's ahead and how much greater it is, I think of this story of this guy who he was absolutely completely obsessed with taking his riches to heaven. And he knew what the Bible taught. He knew that the Bible said, you couldn't take it with you. But he prayed to God every night that he could take some of his possessions with him to heaven. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed, and finally his persistence paid off. One night, God spoke to him in a dream and said, "All right, already, you can take one suitcase and one suitcase only to heaven with you." And so he thought about it diligently and what he would pack in there. And so he packed up the suitcase and put it up in the attic, assuming that he would go up, right? Well, as time passed on, several years later, he did pass away. And as he approached heaven's gates, he was dragging this very heavy suitcase. And the Apostle Peter met him and said, "What are you doing? What do you think you're doing here? You can't bring that in here." And the man said, "You don't understand. I have a deal with God. I prayed to God, and God allowed me to bring one suitcase only." He says, "Well, I doubt that very seriously, but let me go check." And the man said, "Look, I have special permission." So Peter rubbed his beard a little bit, and he said, "All right, let me see what's in there." And so the man reached out, hoisted that big old suitcase up, threw it up there, unzipped it, and it was full to the brim with gold bars and coins. And Peter looked at it and said, "Pavement? You're bringing pavement up here?" Let me tell you something. The stuff that you and I value here is the asphalt of heaven. God paves roads with it. Richard Baxter, who was an influential Puritan in the 17th century and was near to passing away as he was sick, this friend showed up and asked him, "Richard, how are you doing?" And he said, "I'm nearly well, my friend. I'm nearly well." Well, there's more to discuss in our journey on the book of James, but let me leave you with this. A faith that works must be true in this world, and that faith is true if it has been tried. You can't choose your circumstances in this life, but you can choose your perspective when you're going through a difficult time. And there's moments where it's very clear that God is our Father, and He knows what's best for us, even when things are at their worst. I'm going to ask you a few things. We're going to finish up with this. I want you to first think of, can you think of a trial that you've been going through or that you've gone through that has matured you? In the end, you grew up some. Stop right now in prayer, bow your head, and thank God for it. Second thing, if you're presently in a trial, what are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about God? And stop and bow your head and pray for wisdom. Wisdom isn't knowledge. It's very different from knowledge. Wisdom is insights into the underlying circumstances of things. And if you're not going through a trial, but you know somebody who is, then help them go through that trial and help them with perspective. Let's pray together, please. Bow your heads. Lord, will you water what's been sown? We ask that you'll lead us forward to a faith that works, that's authentic, that's robust, that's deep, and we praise you that even though we can't trace your hand, that we trust your heart and that you are a God that doesn't waste moments, that you don't waste pain. You don't even waste the sin that we get ourselves into, that you are a redeemer, and we intend to let perseverance finish its work and increase our value in maturity and spiritual completeness and use it in mighty ways in this time. All right, we're going to pick up verse 13 next week. Thanks.